Hi everyone. Today's 3 stories start off as we hear from a rancher in New Mexico as he shares the details of the thing he saw that changed the way he sees the world. And next we head to a military hospital in San Antonio to learn about the horrifying creature that reveals itself in the middle of the night. Finally, we head to Ohio, where a county sheriff experiences something that causes him to leave his town for good. So get yourself cozy, turn up the volume, and tap on that subscribe button. Great. Now let's get into the stories. Hey Lilith. A week or 2 ago, I heard a story on your channel about a creature I recognized. It's something I've witnessed myself in New Mexico. For a while, I thought I might be insane or hallucinating, but now I know I'm not. I own a decent-sized ranch in the northwestern part of the state. I have a few hundred head of cattle and twice as many chickens. One of the last true ranchers left in the area. I inherited the property from my father, and he inherited it from his, going all the way back to the early 1900s, before New Mexico was even a state. Even way back then, there were stories of monsters and demons living in the desert. Heck, everybody's heard of the chupacabra, but I never paid any of it any mind, thinking that it was all just a bunch of crap. Well, my opinion has changed. You see, about a month ago, some pretty nasty things started happening out in the area. A man that I was good friends with discovered 3 of his dogs torn apart at the edge of his property. Those dogs were tough mixed breeds, too. He used them for elk hunting up north. Whatever killed those poor pups sure wasn't a coyote. I kept my own dog Cruiser close to my side after that. And then a few nights later, we had our own incident. It was late in the evening and the sun had just gone down. I was in Albuquerque all day and had gotten back late, but I still had a few things to take care of before going to sleep. And that's when I heard a commotion coming from the hen house. Sometimes a coyote would come sniffing around and occasionally manage to finagle its way into the hen house, usually at the loss of 1 or 2 of the hens. But as I ran up to the building, I could hear an extreme disturbance coming from inside, and the sounds of hundreds of chickens going berserk. As I threw open the door, I could tell something was seriously wrong. Every hen in the building, about 400 of them, were in an extreme state of panic. I heard the sound of wrenching metal coming from the far side of the building, and I ran to investigate. I was greeted with a scene of chaos. A huge gaping hole had been torn into the side of the house, like something sharp had just sheared through the sheet metal, creating a 10-foot wide gap. Dozens of hens had been torn to pieces. Chicken wire, wood, and feathers were all there in a bloody, twisted mess. Now, I'm a rancher. Raising and slaughtering animals for food is part of what I do, and agree or disagree, it's a vital component of this country's way of life. But even my heart broke a little at the way these poor girls had perished. Wasteful and needless. Whatever had perpetrated this had done so for the sake of just taking lives. We fixed up the damage as best we could, and I asked a few of my hands to stay in our guest house for a few days until whatever this was blew over. I wish that had been the end of it, but there was one last incident. A few nights afterwards, sometime in the middle of the night, I was woken by my wife shaking me violently. She said that Cruiser, who was sleeping at the foot of the bed, had jumped up snarling and took off out of the room and down the stairs. We had a doggy door for Cruiser. He was used to being his own dog, and he was outside right now, barking up a storm at something out there in the darkness. Cruiser was a clever dog and well-trained. If he was alarmed, then it was for a good reason. More importantly, he was my closest and most loyal companion these last 12 years, and I'll be damned if he was going to face whatever he was out there facing alone. Hardly stopping to think, I grabbed my 12-gauge from beside my bed, and like a fool, I ran out into the New Mexico night, with no shoes, no light, and no idea what I was going up against. Before I had made it outside, Cruiser's barking had stopped short. I ran out onto the front porch, and I couldn't see him anywhere. The immediate area was illuminated by lights from the house, but beyond that was complete darkness. I ran to the perimeter of the light, yelling "Cruiser!" repeatedly, in a near state of panic. Suddenly I heard his barking again, and this time it was way out in the darkness. I took off, heading straight for the barking, gravel and stones cutting into the bare skin on my feet. When I got to the spot where I thought I heard Cruiser, I heard his barking again, coming from a different direction. I ran towards it, but before I could reach him, again, the noise changed directions. Another 2 or 3 times this happened, each time taking me further and further from the fading lights of the house. I sat, panting in the darkness, and I knew that something was very wrong. Cruiser hadn't barked in several minutes now, and I wasn't completely sure which direction led back to the house. As I was trying to catch my breath and consider my options, I heard something slinking around just outside my field of vision. And then, the most absolute horrifying moment of my life occurred. From right behind me, not 10 feet away, came a human scream. It was my voice, me, screaming Cruiser, exactly as I had been doing for the last 10 minutes. I turned, raising my shotgun to fire. In the instant before pulling the trigger, I could make out a black shape at least 10 feet high. The area around it seemed brighter in comparison, as if it pulled the darkness into itself. I fired, and in the brief muzzle flash I saw something shooting straight for my head. I felt an impact, and then nothing. One of my field hands found me laying out there in the dark about a quarter mile away from the house. It was a feat of luck that he did, for even a group of 6 men could have easily passed me by in the dark. I was still out of it, and they carried me back to the house and laid me down. The next day I woke up to a bad gash on my head and even worse news. My man who had found me told me that my wife had called them when I ran out into the night. When they came looking for me, they heard my shotgun blast and they followed the noise. He said there was nothing in the area where they found me, except for a pool of thick black liquid leading to a spatter trail going off into the desert. They also found Cruiser, huddled under a bush not too far away from my house, completely on the opposite side of where I had been looking. They could barely get him out from under, and he's still not 100% relaxed again. By the grace of God, nothing else has happened since, though it's only been 2 weeks. I've asked 2 of my hands to move onto the property permanently, and I contracted a security company to install 12+ security cameras around the ranch. I can confirm that there is something deadly out in the New Mexican desert. Call it a chupacabra, or a demon, or whatever, I don't care. All I know is that it's not just an animal hunting for food, it's evil. It toys with its prey, and it kills just for sport. Just be careful out there. Hi, Lilith. I started listening to your channel accidentally a few weeks ago when I was looking for something else. But after hearing some of these stories, I just kept listening. And now I've decided to share something that I've experienced. It's kind of a relief telling somebody because at the time it happened, I was really questioning what I heard and feeling like I should just be quiet about it. When I was in the Army, I spent a couple of years working at a military hospital. I had always intended on going into medicine, but at the time I only took the training for patient administration. Things were typically pretty low-key around there, and much of the time it just felt like an office job. I was stationed in San Antonio and was assigned to mostly work under one particular surgeon. There were times when I had to stay after hours to catch up on paperwork, and there were even a few times that I went in really late at night to catch up on things. I had a real insomnia problem at the time. I will admit, though, that it did feel creepy to be at the hospital late at night. Mainly the side of the hospital that I was on with the offices was especially quiet. There would be an occasional nurse or security guard come through, but that was few and far between. On the night that this all happened, I had gone over around midnight. It was November, and it was cold and snowy, and when I got to the hospital, I walked to the office area but entered through the back door that's reserved just for staff. The front receptionist door was locked since the offices were closed. So I went in and I walked to my desk, which incidentally was all the way by the front receptionist door, but like I said, that door was locked. Everything seemed normal, kind of creepy, but that was usual for that time of night. And so, like every other time I was there late, I turned on a podcast and I got to work. Notably though, since nobody was there, I wasn't using headphones. About an hour in, I thought I heard footsteps mixed in with my podcast. I paused it to see if it was part of the recording or if they were in the building with me, and sure enough, I still heard the footsteps. My first thought was that it was a security guard. They didn't usually come into the office area, but there are glass doors in the front, and they could have seen my light on and were coming to check it out. So I yelled out, "Hello?" There was no answer, but the footsteps didn't stop. So I started to walk over to check things out, thinking maybe they didn't hear me. I walked toward the common area in the office. The lights were off since I had never turned them on. I only turned on the light by the back door and the light by my desk. So the switches were right beside me. I flicked them all on. There was nobody there. But when I turned on the light, very noticeably, the footsteps stopped. I was starting to feel freaked out at this point, and the only thing that made my head not hurt was thinking that maybe one of the doctors had forgotten something. So, leaving the light on, I went and looked around. I didn't see anybody at all. I assumed that I had been imagining things. So eventually, I turned the lights off and I went back to work. But it wasn't even 5 minutes later when I heard the footsteps again. At this point, curiosity and adrenaline made me want to find out exactly what was going on. I also started to have the thought that it could be someone up to no good, and I should intervene. So I went back out to the common area, but this time I was really quiet and I didn't turn the lights on. I walked toward the direction of the footsteps, and as I approached, they stopped. I stood still for a moment, and then I heard the footsteps again, this time back by the office where I had just been working. So I walked there as silently as I could. The same thing happened. The footsteps stopped as I approached. I called out in a normal voice, but it sounded like I was yelling since it was dead quiet. "Is there somebody here? What's going on?" At that point, the door to the surgeon's office, which was right behind me, slammed open and closed. Now that is strange enough to be horrifying, but especially so because that door was always locked. I immediately started to feel this overwhelming sense of doom, and right then the temperature in the room dropped drastically. And at the same time, out of my peripheral vision, I saw a figure flash by with the sound of running footsteps. The sound passed right next to me, and I caught a smell of something like gunpowder. And then the sound and the smell became fainter and fainter. I was petrified. I had been there countless times at night, and I had never encountered anything like this. I made myself go over and look in the office of the surgeon. The door was unlocked, even though I had checked it out as being locked twice before. When I turned on the light, I saw glass shattered on the floor by the desk. It was a framed picture of the surgeon's family. Nothing else in the room looked to be disturbed. I instantly turned around and left the building. When I went outside, it was still snowing, and yet there was no sign of any footprints leaving the building. I couldn't drive away fast enough. That ice-cold fear that I had felt was indescribable. I never even said anything to anybody about it. Every time I tried to imagine telling someone, I thought for sure I would just sound like I was nuts. After that, I did stay late at the hospital a few times, but only if I wasn't alone. I was a county sheriff for a small town in Ohio when this happened. In total, I was there for a couple of years before finding another position closer to my parents' house. They were getting older, and I wanted to be closer to home. At least, that's what I told everybody when I moved away. The reality of it was that I was moving because of an experience I had had on the job in May of 2008. I was called to a home regarding a complaint about some neighborhood kids. I didn't know the details, but I wasn't worried. This type of thing happens all the time, especially in smaller towns where kids don't have that much to do. Sometimes there's property damage that we need to report, but for the most part, it's just harmless pranks. I had a name, an address, and a message about crazy, evil demon children, but that was it. A woman answered the door when I arrived at the house. I would guess her to be in her mid-60s. She was a nice lady, seemed normal enough at our first interaction, but she was terrified to go outside. She asked me to remove my sunglasses before she let me through the door. and I couldn't understand why until later. She told me that 3 kids had come to her door last night, all dressed up in old clothes, like they were Amish or something. She said that they pounded on her front door and claimed that they needed help. Their story was that they were lost and that they needed to use her phone. Of course, she opened the door, but the kids all just stood there with their eyes down, staring at their feet. They repeated their plea that they were lost and they needed to use the phone. She asked the kids where they were from, but they didn't answer. They just kept repeating that they were lost and they needed the phone. And then they asked if they could come inside. The woman told me it was then that she knew something was wrong. She didn't say how she knew, but she knew that she couldn't let them in. She said that she offered to bring her phone out to the porch for them to use, but then they said that they were cold and could they please come inside. The woman again said no, and when she went to close the door, all 3 kids looked up at her. She claimed that it was at that point that she realized they all had black eyes. Not just black irises, but the whole eye was completely black. She slammed her front door and locked it, but she said that as soon as she turned the lock on the door, there was instantly pounding on the back door. She looked across her house, and there were the kids knocking at her back door. She said there was no way they could have gotten there that fast when just a moment earlier they were at the front of her house. She ran to the back door and locked it before they could get in. She then went around to every window in the house, locking and pulling the shades. She then said that she ended up locking herself in her bedroom all night, saying that there was periodic knocking at her windows and her doors all throughout the night. But she was way too terrified to get up and look. I took her story down exactly as she told it, regardless of how ridiculous it sounded. She was convinced that the kids were some evil creatures from hell, but I reassured her that it was most likely a very elaborate prank. It wouldn't be too hard for kids to go to a costume shop and pick up some outfits and black contacts for a prank night. I advised her to look into getting a home security system and some cameras if it would make her feel better. At least she could have some peace of mind. There wasn't much else I could do. I didn't think much about the creepy kids until later that night when I stopped at a gas station to pick up a bottle of water and a few snacks. The gas station was pretty quiet, but that wasn't unusual for that part of town. Then as I got back to my car and closed the door, there was a knock at my window. It was a child, maybe 9 or 10 years old at the most, dressed in what looked like old Victorian-era clothes. I thought, great, I have a lead on the pranksters. But then when I rolled down my window, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. I knew instantly something was wrong. The kid said that he was lost and asked if he could get in my car. My heart jumped in my throat. It was as if my body had sensed the evil. I didn't know what this thing was, this so-called child, but I knew it wasn't human. I asked the kid for his name and where he lived, but he just kept repeating that he was lost and asking to come into my car. It was almost like he didn't know how to say anything else. I told him he couldn't come in, but I could call his parents for him. And then he looked up at me with eyes black as night, and without changing the look on his face, he turned and walked off into the forest on the opposite side of the road. Once he reached the trees, he seemingly disappeared into thin air. I didn't try to follow him, I just knew that that would not end well, and I didn't want to find out exactly what that meant.